What if Mercedes' biggest engine secret isn't something you can see on a dyno, but something hidden so deep in the 2026 rules that most teams never realized it was there to be exploited? Because while the rest of the grid has been openly debating power figures, deployment limits, and reliability targets, Mercedes has been quietly working around a single principle that changes how the entire engine behaves under pressure. Not a trick. Not a loophole. A way of thinking about the regulations that only becomes obvious once it's too late to copy. Inside the paddock, the reaction to this secret hasn't been excitement. It's been discomfort. Because according to insiders, this isn't an advantage you upgrade into, it's one you either build from the start or never fully reach at all. And here's the part that makes this story impossible to leave halfway through. The real impact of Mercedes' engine secret doesn't show up in lap times first. It shows up in who controls races, who dictates development, and who is already forced into compromise before 2026 even begins. Once you see how that works, you start to realize why the people paying the closest attention aren't stepping away from this story anytime soon. Once fragments of this engine concept began circulating quietly inside the paddock, the initial reaction from rival teams wasn't panic. It was disbelief. Because what Mercedes appears to have done doesn't resemble a traditional performance breakthrough. There are no extreme figures. No obvious spikes in output. Instead, the secret lies in how the engine behaves over time, how it manages energy, stress, and efficiency across an entire operating window rather than at isolated peaks. That kind of advantage doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself slowly, as others start asking why their perfectly legal solutions always seem to carry compromises Mercedes doesn't appear to face. What makes this approach so unsettling is that it required committing very early to a specific philosophy. Mercedes didn't wait for consensus. They didn't hedge multiple concepts in parallel. They appear to have chosen a single interpretation of the 2026 framework and built everything around it even before it was clear that interpretation would be optimal. That decision carries enormous risk. But if it pays off, it creates a kind of momentum rivals simply can't recreate later, no matter how much data they collect once the season begins. According to sources familiar with the project, the core of this secret isn't about extracting more power. It's about reducing conflict. Conflict between electrical deployment and mechanical grip. Between thermal limits and sustained load. Between short-term aggression and long-term stability. By minimizing those internal fights, the engine becomes easier to live with, and an engine that's easier to live with frees the entire car concept from constant self-protection. That freedom is where the real lap time hides. Inside rival power unit departments, this has triggered a deeply uncomfortable realization. Even if they now understand what Mercedes may have done, they can't simply replicate it. Their architectures are already shaped by different assumptions. Cooling layouts are fixed. Energy strategies are embedded. Software philosophies are locked into hardware decisions made years ago. Trying to pivot now wouldn't just be expensive, it would be destabilizing. And destabilization so close to 2026 is a risk few teams can afford. There's also a driver-related dimension that makes this secret even more powerful. An engine that delivers energy smoothly and predictably allows drivers to operate closer to instinct. Less correction. Less compromise. More confidence on corner entry and exit. That doesn't just improve lap times. It changes how races are managed, how tires are treated, and how pressure is applied to rivals over long stints. Those are advantages that compound quietly, without ever needing to dominate headlines. From the FIA's perspective, this is where the situation becomes delicate. Nothing about this concept appears to violate the rules. In fact, it may represent the most faithful possible reading of them. But when one interpretation produces such a structurally different outcome, questions inevitably follow about intent versus effect. The regulations were designed to converge performance, not to reward early philosophical certainty so decisively. That tension hasn't exploded yet, but it's clearly building. And this is why Mercedes' biggest engine secret remains exactly that. Because it isn't a trick that can be banned. It isn't a loophole that can be closed. It's a way of understanding the regulations that only works if you commit before anyone else realizes what really matters. By the time that understanding becomes obvious to the rest of the grid, it may already be too late to change direction. And if that's the case, then this secret won't define Mercedes' 2026 season alone, it will define how the next era of Formula One quietly slipped out of reach for everyone else. As teams begin to fully internalize what Mercedes may have locked in so early, the conversation shifts from what the secret is to what it allows. Because an engine that behaves coherently across conditions doesn't just deliver performance, it simplifies everything built around it. Aerodynamicists gain confidence to push concepts closer to instability. Strategists gain freedom to vary race plans without protecting weak phases. And engineers stop firefighting internal contradictions. That systemic calm is incredibly rare at the start of a regulation cycle, and it's why rivals aren't asking how fast Mercedes will be, they're asking how much margin Mercedes has already created. What's particularly unsettling is how this secret reframes development speed itself. When a concept is internally conflicted, progress slows no matter how talented the team is. Every gain creates a new problem somewhere else. But if Mercedes' engine architecture truly reduces those internal trade-offs, then development becomes additive instead of corrective. Each update stacks cleanly on the last. That kind of efficiency doesn't show up in headlines, but it determines who arrives at races with solutions instead of questions. Inside rival power unit programs, there's a growing fear that this advantage is invisible until it's too late. Early on, lap times may look close. Performance graphs may overlap. But over long stints, in changing conditions, under pressure, Mercedes' concept may simply degrade less. Not because it's stronger, but because it's calmer. And calm systems are brutally effective in a sport where everyone else is constantly compensating. There's also a long-term consequence that's only now being discussed seriously. If Mercedes' interpretation proves correct, it may redefine what optimal even means under the 2026 rules. Teams chasing peak numbers could find themselves trapped in unstable architectures. Teams prioritizing flexibility may discover they left performance on the table. Mercedes appears to have targeted something else entirely, a balance point that doesn't collapse when variables shift. That's not an easy thing to identify, and it's almost impossible to reverse engineer once paths diverge. Politically, this puts the FIA in an uncomfortable position. There's nothing to penalize. Nothing to rewrite cleanly. Mercedes hasn't exploited a loophole, it's exploited timing and conviction. And regulating conviction is not something a rulebook can do. Any attempt to rebalance now risks undermining the very idea of innovation the sport claims to protect. Yet allowing the gap to form unchecked risks repeating the very dominant cycles the 2026 rules were meant to avoid. What makes this secret especially powerful is that it doesn't rely on secrecy forever. Even if everyone understands it eventually, understanding alone isn't enough. By the time rivals fully grasp the implications, their architectures are already frozen. Budgets are spent. Philosophies are committed. And switching direction would mean accepting years of competitive loss. That's how advantages become eras, not through speed, but through irreversibility. And this is why Mercedes' biggest engine secret still hasn't fully revealed itself. Because its true impact won't be visible in one qualifying session or one race win. It will appear gradually, as others hit limits Mercedes never seems to reach. As strategies play out more smoothly. As development curves flatten for some and keep climbing for one. By the time the pattern is obvious to everyone watching, the secret won't feel like a revelation anymore. It will feel like something that was always there, quietly deciding the shape of the next era while the rest of the grid was still looking in the wrong places. As the implications of this engine concept continue to settle, another layer of tension begins to emerge, one that has nothing to do with outright performance. Teams are starting to realize that Mercedes' secret may have reshaped the risk profile of development itself. Where others are constantly balancing between aggression and fragility, Mercedes appears to have reduced the cost of being wrong. Mistakes don't cascade as severely. Updates don't destabilize the whole system. That resilience changes everything, because it allows a team to push forward without constantly fearing collapse. And in Formula One, the team that can afford to be wrong occasionally often ends up being right more often than everyone else. What's deeply unsettling for rivals is how early this resilience seems to have been engineered. This wasn't a late optimization or a lucky convergence. It required structural decisions made before most teams were confident enough to commit. Those decisions now act like guardrails, keeping development pointed in the right direction even when conditions change. That means Mercedes isn't just faster at solving problems, it faces fewer existential ones in the first place. And that advantage compounds quietly, month after month, while others are forced into reactive cycles. Inside rival organizations, this has triggered a very specific fear. Not that Mercedes has found more power, but that Mercedes has reduced uncertainty. Uncertainty is what keeps the grid close. It forces teams to slow down, double-check, and hedge. If one team operates with less uncertainty than the rest, it doesn't need to gamble. It can simply execute. And execution, repeated consistently, is how gaps open without any single dramatic breakthrough. There is also a growing belief that this engine philosophy has consequences far beyond the power unit itself. A predictable energy profile changes braking behavior. That changes tire temperatures. That changes aero sensitivity. Suddenly, advantages appear in areas that have nothing to do with the engine on paper. That's what makes this secret so difficult to isolate and attack. You're not fighting a component. You're fighting an ecosystem that behaves differently under stress. From a strategic standpoint, this gives Mercedes an advantage that's almost invisible to the public. They can afford to think longer term. They don't need to chase short-term gains that introduce instability. They can prioritize reliability, learning, and refinement while others are forced into riskier moves just to stay close. Over a long season and an entire regulation cycle, that difference in approach becomes decisive. Not because Mercedes is more aggressive, but because it doesn't need to be. The FIA, watching this unfold, faces a familiar but uncomfortable dilemma. Nothing here violates the rules. Nothing here can be neatly regulated away. Mercedes has simply interpreted the framework with unusual conviction and followed through without hesitation. That puts regulators in a position where intervention would feel artificial, yet inaction risks allowing a structural imbalance to grow unchecked. It's the kind of tension that rarely explodes publicly, but quietly shapes how future clarifications are written. And this is why Mercedes' biggest engine secret still hasn't reached its final chapter. Because its true impact won't be measured in one season or one title fight. It will be measured in how often Mercedes looks composed while others look strained. In how rarely its development path needs radical correction. In how quickly it adapts when conditions change. By the time those patterns become obvious to everyone watching, the secret won't feel like a revelation anymore. It will feel like something that was always there, quietly defining the limits of what the rest of the grid could realistically achieve. As this picture becomes clearer, another uncomfortable truth begins to surface inside the paddock. Mercedes' biggest engine secret may not just be about gaining an advantage, it may be about removing pressure. Pressure normally forces teams into risky decisions, rushed upgrades, and aggressive interpretations just to keep up. If Mercedes' concept genuinely reduces internal stress within the power unit, then it also reduces organizational stress. Engineers stop firefighting. Management stops second-guessing. And when a team operates without constant internal tension, its decision-making becomes sharper, faster, and more unified than rivals realize. What worries competitors most is that this advantage doesn't require perfection to function. Most engine concepts demand precise operating windows to deliver performance. Stray outside them, and everything unravels. Mercedes' approach, according to insiders, appears tolerant. Tolerant of temperature variation. Tolerant of energy fluctuations. Tolerant of real-world racing chaos. That tolerance means Mercedes can extract performance without dancing on the edge of failure, and that fundamentally alters how aggressively a team can race over an entire season. Inside rival power unit programs, this has triggered a silent fear that no upgrade can solve. Even if raw performance gaps can be closed, behavioral gaps cannot. You can add power. You can improve efficiency. But you cannot easily recreate a system that was designed from the start to stay stable under pressure. That kind of behavior is architectural. And architecture, once frozen, defines the limits of what future updates can realistically achieve. There is also a growing sense that Mercedes' secret may influence how races are controlled rather than how they're won. A car that behaves consistently allows drivers to dictate pace instead of reacting to it. They can manage tires more predictably, control energy deployment with confidence, force rivals into uncomfortable strategies simply by maintaining pressure without visible effort. Those are not spectacular advantages. They are suffocating ones. And historically, suffocating advantages are the ones that turn close competition into quiet dominance. Strategically, this gives Mercedes a luxury few teams enjoy at the start of a new regulation cycle: patience. They don't need to chase every innovation headline. They don't need to gamble on high-risk upgrades. They can afford to wait, observe, and refine while others feel compelled to roll the dice. That asymmetry and urgency is incredibly powerful. Because the team that doesn't need to take risks often ends up benefiting from others' mistakes. From the FIA's standpoint, this situation is deeply awkward. Nothing about Mercedes' engine secret violates the written rules. Yet its consequences may contradict the spirit of convergence those rules were meant to deliver. But regulating against outcomes rather than actions is a dangerous path. Once you start intervening based on who benefits most, you undermine the legitimacy of innovation itself. That leaves the FIA watching closely, aware of the imbalance, but with few clean tools to address it without opening a much larger controversy. And this is why Mercedes' biggest engine secret still feels unresolved rather than exposed. Because its true impact won't be obvious in the early headlines of 2026. It will emerge slowly, as patterns. As weekends where Mercedes looks calm while others look reactive. As seasons where development continues smoothly for one team while rivals hit invisible ceilings. By the time those patterns become undeniable, the secret will no longer feel like a revelation. It will feel like something that quietly shaped the entire era long before anyone outside Mercedes realized what they were really looking at.